He himself was well aware of the difficult nature of such deceptively simple judgments. He said, and this fragment ties very well with the story told by Herodotus, most hard is it to perceive the hidden measure of judgment, which nevertheless, even though it appears not, holds the limits of all things, aphanes, the hidden, the non-manifest measure of all things. Solon sounds here like a predecessor of Socrates, who also wanted to bring, as was said later, philosophy down from the sky to the earth, and therefore began to examine the invisible measures by which we judge human affairs. He raised the question, what is happiness? As Socrates later was to raise the question, what is courage, piety, friendship, knowledge, justice, etc. And Solon still gives a kind of an answer, where Socrates concludes virtually all the strictly Socratic dialogues by saying, I have failed utterly to discover what it is, what we were talking about. That's the end of the Charmides. And this aporetic character of Socratic thinking means the admiring wonder at just or courageous deeds seen by the eyes of the body gives birth to such questions as what is courage, what is justice. The existence of courage or justice is indicated by what I have seen, though they themselves were not given in sense perception. But the original wonder is not only not resolved in such questions, since they remain without answer, but even reinforced. What begins as wonder ends in perplexity, and therefore leads back to wonder. How marvelous that men can perform courageous and just deeds, even though they do not know, cannot give account of what courage and justice is. That is as though Socrates said it. There is, of course, a decisive difference between Plato or Parmenides' quest for divine matters and the seemingly so much more humble attempts of Socrates at defining Solon's unseen measures that bind and determine human affairs. In this difference we are not interested here, although its historical and political and philosophical relevance is very great. Its political relevance is even greater. What matters in our context is that in both instances the thought is concerned with things invisible but indicated by appearances, the starry sky above us, or the deeds of men. That is, with invisibles which are present in the visible world, very much like the Homeric gods walking among men through the battles around Troy. And the chief thing to be noted about these matters that arouse wonder and are then transformed into thoughts is that they always concern something admirable, something to be affirmed and confirmed. Plato clearly thinks it simply absurd to ascribe ideas to them. In these cases, he says, the things are just the things we see. All tells us that it is better to retreat at this point for fear of falling into a bottomless pit of nonsense. All that is from the Parmenides. He then points out to Socrates, who there is a young Socrates, that he is still young, and that later on he will not despise such objects. But the difficulty is not resolved, and the question never again raised by Plato. We are not interested here in the doctrine of ideas, or are interested only to the extent that one could demonstrate that the notion of ideas occurred to Plato because of beautiful things and would never have occurred to him had he been surrounded by nothing but trivial and undignified objects. Now, in the attempt to enumerate and identify some of the sources of non-cognitive thinking, I have emphasized on purpose the element of admiration which we encounter so powerfully in Greek philosophy and pre-philosophical thought, and can trace, not as a matter of influence, but of ever-repeated original experience throughout the history of philosophy. I am not at all sure that this runs counter to present-day experiences in this matter, but I am quite certain that it does run counter to our common opinions on them. Common sense seems to suggest that even though man's extremity may no longer be God's opportunity, it still is, especially when it comes to the so-called ultimate question, the opportunity of thought. And in view of the peculiarities of this kind of thinking which moves among invisibles, hence leaves the world of appearances out of its own accord, does not this opinion make much more sense? To put it bluntly, were not the Romans right when they said philosophy was only good for old people who were to disappear from this world anyhow very soon? And should not the first impulse for thought be an impulse to escape a world that has become unbearable? You will remember those famous words of Hegel about the relation of thought, or as he said, of philosophy to reality, from the preface of the philosophy of right. Philosophy as a thought of the world appears only when actuality has been completed. When philosophy paints its gray and gray, then has the shape of life grown old. By philosophy it cannot be rejuvenated, but only understood. The owl of Minerva spreads its wing with the falling of dusk. And before as well as after he wrote these lines, he said the same even more poignantly, less equivocally, in his first published book. The need for philosophy arises when the unifying power has disappeared from the life of man, when the opposites have lost the living tension of their relatedness in their mutual interdependence and have become autonomous. Sounds a bit like Yeats. Out of this unity of being torn apart arises thought, the need for reconciliation. Entzweiung ist der Quell des Bedürfnisses der Philosophie. And in the late lectures on the history of philosophy, he again insisted that philosophy appears on the scene when a break has occurred in the real world. The mind is discovered as the interior realm into which men can escape when the real world no longer satisfies them. The great example is, of course, Plato and Aristotle, the coming of age of philosophy immediately after the disaster of the Peloponnesian War. In Hegel, this notion about the existential root of thinking is deeply equivocal. It can signify that the meaning of events is revealed only at the end. A thought we have quoted already in Homer's and Pindar's notion of the Bard, and in Solon's conviction that no man can be praised happy before his death. But it can also indicate that it is a disintegration of reality and the resulting disunity of man and the world that drive men into thinking, arouse in them the need for philosophy, namely the need for another, more meaningful world. This latter, thinking springing from the desire to escape from the world, is probably no less old than the roots we tried to discover in Greece, but it found its classic expression much later, among the Greeks and the Romans who lived amid the changing fortunes of the Roman Empire. It was during these long centuries that philosophy became what, according to public opinion, it still is, something you turn to in catastrophe, the medicina anima, the medicine for your mind, as in Cicero. And it began in the last century of the Roman Republic, when Lucretius and Cicero transformed Greek philosophy into something essentially Roman, and that meant, among other things, something essentially practical. Thinking consists, according to Epictetus, the Greek slave and probably the best, most acute mind among the Stoics, thinking consists of the correct use of our imagination, the only thing which we have in our power. Everything else comes from the outside and compels us. We need only deny the impact of these necessities, and nothing will be able to perturb us. I must die, says Epictetus, but must I also die sighing? I can't help being chained, but can't I help weeping? Sent into exile, but why not go laughing and in good spirits? You want to know my secret, I won't say it, this is in my power. You threaten to handcuff me. Man, what are you saying? You can't handcuff me, you manacle my hands. You are threatening to behead me. When did I say that my head could not be cut off? Obviously, these are not mere exercises in thinking, but exercise in the power of the will, of which Epictetus had made a kind of philosophical system. This would be of considerable interest to us if we were here concerned with the phenomenon of the will, an altogether different mental ability whose chief characteristic is that it speaks in imperatives, even when it commands nothing but our ability to think. The goal is to annihilate reality insofar as it concerns me. And the presupposition is, as far as I am concerned, everything that is depends in its reality upon my recognition. Terminologically speaking, it is not only being as distinguished from all particular entities that manifests itself in thinking, as Heidegger says, non-being is also thinkable if the will commands the mind. If I really find the world unbearable, it's no longer being but nothingness that manifests itself in thinking. To be sure, in this extremity, thinking is no longer on its own. It has become a mere instrument that does the bidding of the will as its master. But it may be noteworthy that this thinking ability of ours, an ability that is at home among invisibles, among things that whatever else they may be are absent and therefore in need of imagination, that the faculty of representation is enlisted at all when reality has become unbearable. For we certainly are more inclined to believe that the will in such an extremity will enlist our capacity of faith and produce a manifold beliefs in a hereafter rather than simply appeal to reason and imagination to think yourself, so to speak, out of the world. Now, Epictetus lived under the rule of Nero, but it was much earlier, during the last century before Christ, when Cicero, the most cultivated among the Romans, had a foreboding of disaster, that everything is gradually decaying and nearing its end, worn out by old age, as Lucretius put it, and discovered that one could think one's way out of the world, and that such thought trains by no means as extreme as in the case of Epictetus were likely to offer comfort and help in the world as it is. Men who could teach such thought trains were highly esteemed. Lucretius calls Epicurus, who after 200 years of his death became the master of his most gifted pupil, a god, because he was the first to invent a way of life which is now called wisdom, and through his art rescued life from such storms and so much darkness. For our purpose, however, Lucretius is not so good. He does not insist on thinking but on knowing. Knowledge acquired by reason will dispel ignorance and thus destroy the greatest evil, which is fear, whose source is superstition. A much more appropriate example is Cicero's famous dream of Scipio, the end of the Republic. Their thinking is not inspired by fear. In order to understand how extraordinary this conclusion of Cicero's Republic actually is, how strange its thoughts must have sounded to Roman ears, we must for a moment remember the general background against which it was written. Philosophy had found a kind of a foster home in Rome during the last century of the Republic, and in this thoroughly political society, it had first of all to prove that it was good for something. In the Tusculan Disputation, we find Cicero's first answer. It was a question of making Rome more beautiful and more civilized. It was nothing essential. It was a proper occupation for educated men when they had no more important things to worry about. It was not a question of divine matters, founding and conserving political communities where the activities most closely resembling the ways of the gods. Nor had it anything to do with immortality. Immortality was human as well as divine, but it was not the property of individual men, for whom death, as Cicero said, is not only necessary, but frequently desirable. Immortality, however, was definitely the potential property of human communities. If a commonwealth is destroyed and is extinguished, it is as though the whole world perished and collapsed. For communities, death is neither necessary nor ever desirable. It comes as punishment only, for a community ought to and can be so constituted that it is eternal. And what I just now quoted comes from the same dialogue, the same treatise, which ends with Scipio's dream. So it was not as though Cicero had changed his mind. As a matter of fact, nothing, even in the book itself, prepares us for the end, except perhaps the Lamentations of Book 5, only in words, and because of our vices and for no other reasons do we still retain and keep the public thing, the thing itself we have lost long since. And then comes the dream. Scipio Africanus, the victor of Carthage, tells of a dream he had shortly before he destroyed the city. The dream showed him a hereafter. Be aware, it was a dream, where he meets his ancestor who tells him about Carthage, and also that after that he would have to restore the public thing, the Republic, in Rome as a dictator if he could escape being assassinated. Actually, he couldn't. Cicero meant to say that Scipio might have been able to save the Republic. And in order to do his job properly of saving the Republic, to summon up the necessary courage, he is told in his dream by his ancestor, he should hold as follows, sic habeto. It's very difficult to hold as follows is really the best translation for it. It doesn't mean that this is something which you ought to believe, but it means it will be good for you to think along this line. Men who preserve the patria, the fatherland, are certain to find their final place in heaven, where they will enjoy and will be blessed with eternal time. For the highest God who governs the world likes nothing better than the assemblies and the intercourses of men called commonwealths. Their governors and conservators return to heaven after having left this world. Their job on earth is to stand guard over the earth. Now this, of course, does not imply a Christian promise of resurrection and a hereafter, and although the divine wishes are still in the vein of Roman traditions, there sounds an ominous note in it. It is as though men without such promised reward might no longer want to do what the public thing expects them to do. For, and this is essential, the rewards of this world, Scipio is told, are not merely not enough to compensate you for your labors. They are non-substantial and unreal if you think about them from the right perspective. Scipio, high up in heaven, is invited to look down on the earth, and the earth appeared so small that he was pained to see our empire as a mere dot. Whereupon he is told, if the earth appears small to you from here, then always look up to the sky so that you may be able to despise these human matters. For what kind of celebrity is it that you may be able to attain in the conversation of men, of what kind of glory among them? Don't you see how narrow the space is in which glory and fame are localized? And those who speak about us today, how long will they talk? And even if there were reason to trust tradition and the memory of future generations, there will be natural catastrophes so that we cannot obtain a long-lasting fame, let alone an eternal one. If you look up, you will see how futile all this is. Fame was never eternal, and the oblivion of eternity extinguishes it. I have given you the gist of these pages at some length to enable you to see the open contradiction of these proposed thought trains to what Cicero, in common with educated Romans, actually had always believed in and had expressed even in the same book. In our context, I wanted to show you an example, and an eminent one, how certain thought trains actually aim at thinking oneself out of the world, and that the way to do that is relativization. Relative to the universe, the earth is but a dot. What does it matter what happens on her? Relative to the immensities of time, centuries are but moments, and oblivion will finally cover everything and everybody. What does it matter what men do? Relative to death, the same for all, everything specific and distinguishing loses its weight. If there is no hereafter, something that appears in Cicero but not as an article of faith, but as a moral hypothesis, so to speak, whatever you do or suffer, it doesn't matter. To think means here to follow a sequence of reasoning that will lift you to a viewpoint outside the world of appearances as well as outside your own life. Philosophy is needed to compensate for the frustration of politics and more generally for life itself. But this is a mere beginning of a tradition that reached its climax about 500 years later at the end of the Roman Empire. Boëtius' Consolation of Philosophy, one of the most popular books throughout the Middle Ages and hardly read by anyone today, was written in a condition of extremity of which Cicero had no premonition. Boëtius, a noble Roman, had fallen from the height of fortune, found himself in jail, and awaited his execution. Because of this setting, the book has always been likened to the Phaedon, a rather strange analogy. Socrates, in the midst of his friends, after a trial in which he had been permitted to speak at length in his own defense, awaiting an easy and painless death, and Boëtius, thrown into jail without trial, absolutely alone after the death sentence pronounced at a mock trial at which he was not present, let alone given the opportunity of a defense, and now awaiting not a painless death but a horrible death by slow and abominable torture. Although he is a Christian, it is philosophy, and neither God nor Christ who comes to console him. And although he had spent his secret leisure, as he tells us, while still in high office, in studying Plato and Aristotle, he consoles himself now with typical Ciceronian and also other Stoic thought trains, except that what was mere relativization and Scipio's dream is now turned into an almost violent annihilation. The immense spaces of eternity to which you must turn your mind annihilate reality as it exists for mortals. The ever-changing nature of fortune annihilates all pleasures, for even if you enjoy what fortune has given you, riches, honors, fame, you are in constant fear of losing it. Fear annihilates all happiness. Everything you unthinkingly believe does exist, exists not, once you begin to think about it. That is what philosophy, the goddess of consolation, tells him. And in this context, the question of evil, which hardly is touched upon by Cicero, comes up. The thought train concerning evil, still rather primitive and Boëtius, contains already all the elements which we later find in a much more sophisticated and complex form throughout the tradition. It runs as follows. God is the final cause of everything that is. God, as the highest good, cannot be the cause of evil. Everything that is must have a cause. Since there are only apparent causes but no ultimate cause of evil, evil does not exist. The wicked ones, says this philosophy, are not only not powerful, they are trivial, they are not. What you unthinkingly consider evil has its place in the order of the universe, and insofar as it is necessarily good. Its bad aspects are an illusion of the senses of which you can get rid of through thinking. It is the old Stoic advice, what you negate by thought, and thought is in your power, cannot affect you. Thinking makes it unreal. We are, of course, immediately reminded of Epictetus' glorification of what we today would call willpower. And there's undeniably an element of willing in this kind of thinking. To think along these lines means to act upon yourself, the only action left when all acting in the world has become futile. What is so very striking about this thinking in late antiquity is that it has become centered exclusively about the self. The answer to it in a world that is not yet completely out of joint will say with John Adams, a deathbed, it is said, shows the emptiness of titles that may be. Shall laws and government which regulate sublunar things be neglected because they appear baubles at the hour of death?